Good morning everyone. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we will be looking at how to create a RESTful API using a API gateway, as well as you can integrate this API gateway to the Lambda function. Firstly, I will just give you overview of what this entire architecture is. So if you wanted to build a serverless architecture, you can go for this API gateway as well as to the Lambda function. So you can just trigger a server whenever user hit your API. So you need not worry about cumbersome servers maintaining the overall infrastructure over it. So your servers need not be always active. So whenever you need to access your server, then you can go for your serverless architecture. So let's let's go dive deep into our task. So firstly, what happens is a client will interact with your API gateway, which is provided by the Amazon Web Service. So from here, so this is the trigger point actually. The user will be hitting this API gateway, and once the user hits the API gateway, uh, you will be triggering this Lambda function. So behind the scenes, this Lambda function will execute server tasks. So it will just return back you the response, and this API gateway will redirect that response to the client. So this is how the serverless architecture works in the AWS. So all you need to do is you just have to create a API gateway and then write a Lambda function. Now this is my Amazon console. So firstly you need to create a API gateway, as well as you need to create a Lambda function. You see that it's a run code without thinking about the servers. Behind the scenes, it uses a server, but it is entirely managed by the AWS. So we will be making use of this Node.js. So let's create a function. Now we will be creating this from a scratch. Now we can give a function name as my first Lambda function. So we can use the runtime as Node.js, and you can just use the default settings here. Now it's change default execution role. We can create a new role from the AWS policy template. Now let's give it our role name as my first Lambda role. It's asking for a policy template. You can leave it since it's an optional. We need not fill it. Let's create a function. It will take a couple of minutes to get created. Now let's hit back to this API gateway. Here there are many services like HTTP API and a WebSocket API and a REST API and a API private. If you are using a virtual private code, then you can go for this REST API. So only certain people can access this, but we are going for a public. So we are going to develop a REST API, and it clearly says that it works with a Lambda. So that is what we are going to use. And if you wanted to establish a dual communication and a real-time communication, you can go for a WebSocket as well. Okay, now let's go to this REST API and click on build. Now we are going to entirely create a new API, and you can give your API name like my first API and you can give it as regional. What is the difference between a regional and edge optimized is, if the whole world has to access your application, then you can go for a edge optimized. And if it's regional, you can see that these are the regions present. In the US, there are 4 regions, and in the Asia Pacific, there are multiple things. Now we will be selecting the default US East one regional, and let's create an API. You can see that it clearly says that you need to add a trigger to execute this Lambda function. But before that, let's create a API gateway. So that API gateway will trigger this Lambda function. So what happens is the user will just hit your API, and this API gateway will trigger this Lambda function. So we have created this API gateway, and we need to add a resource. Let's create a resource. So let's you need not proxy the resource. Let's keep it as a default thing, unchecked. And the resource path can be slash, and the resource name, you can give any resource name, like you can give like, okay, movies. You can uncheck this course. What is course is, it's a cross origin resource sharing. Suppose assume there are two entirely different domain, one is Google and another one is Amazon. So if Google want to access certain resources from the Amazon, then you can enable this course and then specify which domain has to access your resource. So you can restrict your resource sharing with the domain only you have specified. Now I'm not enabling this course because everybody around the world can access my resources. So I'm just unchecking this, and I will just create a resource. Now you see that a resource got created, and we have to create a methods. So since we are using the REST API, there are 5 main methods. One is get, to get a resource, and post, which is useful for adding a content, and another one will be put, to update your content, as well as a delete, to delete your content, and patch, which is also same as put, but difference between a put and patch is, put will update your old object, but a patch will partially update your objects. Only the part of content will be updated. For now I will just keep it as any method. And since I already told you that this API gateway will be a trigger point, and I will be using this API gateway as a trigger point to trigger my Lambda function. So we have already created a Lambda function, so I will be checking this integration type as Lambda function, and I will just uncheck this. And we have already created a region, east one, for this API gateway as well as for this Lambda function. So I will be using this US East one, and the Lambda function we have already created my first Lambda function. Like, you can keep this as default thing, and the request body, everything can be, you need not add it currently. So you see how fast it got created. Okay, now the thing is, you have done almost everything, but you need to deploy this API to make it work. Now, since there are no staging available, what is staging is, firstly I will give you overview. A developer will develop an application, and it will be moved to a dev environment, and once it's got approved by the developer, it will move to the testing environment. And once the tester has fulfilled and given a certificate that it is ready to be deployed to the prod, it will be moving to the production environment. Likewise, you can create a various stage. Currently you can create a test node stage and give your stage name as Okay, now let's keep it as dev stage, and this the development description is optional. You need not fill it. You can just click on deploy. It will deploy your thing, right? So this will be your invoke URL, but you haven't written a Lambda function, right? So let's write a Lambda function. Let's refresh this thing. So once after the refreshing, you can see that the trigger point to this API gateway, and this is your Lambda function, and your code is something like this, right? Hello from Lambda. It will return a hello from Lambda. So context and callback. Now let's return this callback and null and response. And then from here you can deploy. I'm just returning this response and it got deployed. And now you can come over this function, Lambda function. Let's see. Let's see the configuration. Okay. So triggers. Okay. So this is our API endpoint. Now let's try hitting this. Since I have given movies as any method, you see that it's returning hello from Lambda. Now let's make it even more interesting. Okay, now let's come to this function. Now let's go to code. Let's head to ChatGPT. Give me list of 20 movies data in JSON format. Object format. You see that it's returning, right? Let it get generated. In the meantime, let's come over here. Let's edit this response. Now this data is going to be array of objects. Is it generated? Now let's deploy. Now let's try hitting. You see how fast this is. Now it is coming inside the body, right? So instead of calling it body, let's call it as data. Let's deploy. You need not deploy your API gateway again and again, right? You can just modify your Lambda function and it just works fine. So This is how proxy integration works. There are also non-proxy integration. We will be checking that later. If you really like the video, just comment down. I will just make another video on it. Okay.